Welcome to section 2.4 in the CCT Data Center course. In this video, we're going to talk about fabric interconnects and fabric extenders. Topics in this video include what are the basics of what fabric interconnects are. Then we're going to look at fabric interconnect specifications and install guides. Then we're going to look at fabric extenders, fabric extender specifications, and their install guides as well. All right, so what are fabric interconnects? First off, we usually refer to them as FIs. That's the abbreviation for them. So if you hear me say FI or somebody else say FI, that's what they're talking about. So fabric interconnects are an essential part of the UCS infrastructure. They have the embedded UCS manager, which is what you use to manage the entire UCS fabric. They also act as a gateway to the UCS fabric. So they connect to the SAN. They provide a gateway to the LAN and WAN. They can connect upstream to a core device for the whole network. And basically, they provide access for everything to the UCS infrastructure. And then another core concept is that of the unified fabric that came about with Fibre channel over Ethernet. When Fibre channel over Ethernet came about, the fabric interconnects started having unified ports, which means that they can function as both Fibre channel ports or Ethernet ports. And this helps consolidate I/O. You can have the SAN and the Ethernet portion of the data center on the same infrastructure, which means you're going to need less devices and it's going to be a lot simpler to manage. So as an example, we have the 6454. The 6 says that it's a fabric interconnect. Then that second number, the 4, is going to designate the generation. So it's going to be the 4th generation. And then the last 2 digits, which are 54, is going to say how many ports are on that particular fabric interconnect. So in order to understand FEX, it's good to understand what problem did FEXes solve. So originally in data centers, there was end of rack switches and middle of rack switches. And all of the UCS hosts and servers would need to connect to a switch. So if you had your switches at the end of a row or in the middle of a row, it creates a lot of cabling between the racks. So in the next evolution, they started having top of rack switches. In order to minimize cabling, they were putting a switch at the top of every rack. And then in order to make sure that they were redundant, they started putting 2 switches at the top of every rack. And the end result of this is that the entire solution became extremely expensive. So the FEXes were the solution to all of this. Basically, they're a completely unintelligent switching device. They have no features in them, so they're able to produce them much more cheaply than a full-featured switch, which allows them to put 1 or 2 top-of-rack patch devices. It's basically like a controllable patch panel. That's how I look at it. Now, these things cannot perform their own switching. Like I said, they're completely unintelligent. They do not have CAM tables, which means that they require an upstream parent switch that basically does the switching for it. This can be either the fabric interconnect or there is a number of different Nexus switches that can do it. So there's switches within the 5K Nexus line, the 7K Nexus line, and the 9K Nexus line that can all be parent switches. So the FEX's job is pretty simple. It is to simply directly connect to the UCS servers. And again, the naming convention here, it's the same principles as with the fabric interconnects. The 2000 series is designated for the FEXes. So the 2 means that you're dealing with the FEX. The second digit, the 3 right there, is going to say that it's a 3rd generation FEX, and the last 2 digits, 32, means that there's 32 ports on the switch, or on the FEX. All right, so now we're going to look at documentation for the fabric interconnects and FEXes. So you can see here we have the 6400 series and the 6300 series fabric interconnects. The 6400 series is going to be newer. And then down here we have these modules, so these FEXes that can... And so down here we have the modules. So these are the FEXes that go directly into the UCS B series chassis, the 5108. And again, those provide the network access for the B series chassis. And when we're comparing the 6400 series to the 6300 series, you can see that the 6400 series goes up to 100 gigabits, while the 6300 series only goes up to 40 gigabits. The 6400 series does have unified ports in it. There are some models of the 6300 series that also have unified ports. And now we're going to move on to the Nexus 2K FEXes. So on that previous page that we were looking at, it only had those modules, the FEXs that were modules that go directly into the 5108 chassis, because we were coming off of the branch for the UCS solution. Now these ones that we're looking at here, these full width ones that are meant to be mounted in racks by themselves, are actually part of the Nexus line, so that's why they weren't on the other page. So all we're going to do is just come down here and click Compare Models. All right, so there is one distinction that I would like to say. I know earlier in the video I said that the last 2 digits represent the number of ports. It's actually the number of downstream. And now if you'll notice, these 4 digits are accompanied by some letters afterwards, so there's patterns to those as well. The first letter is going to be the downstream port type, so T means Ethernet, and the second letter is going to be the upstream port type. And P tends to mean 10 gigabit SFP+. You can see TP. And so whenever you see E, whenever you see E, that just typically means enhanced. It means that the original version was released and then they released a new and improved version that usually costs the same. So whenever you see the E version, that's usually what you order. We're going to move on to the next gen here. So here we have the 3rd generation, and we have some 2nd generation over here as well. So yeah, so this version that we were looking at here, these ones are going to be gig only. I don't even think they're sold anymore, just because everything's going to 10 gig now. All right, and just adding a little bit more to the naming convention here. The Q equals QSFP+, which is 40 gig. And the M also tends to mean SFP+. So it can mean the same as P. And then the only other thing to note is that the 10G base T, so these are going to be primarily Ethernet based FEXs, and these ones are going to be SFP+. All right, so I have Googled Cisco UCS. All right, so I've Googled Cisco UCS Fabric Interconnect installation guides. The 6400 series came up. So I'm on the product overview page. And so with these Fabric Interconnects, it's going to be simpler than with the UCS server, since you're pretty much only looking at the front and rear panel. But it is really important to understand this, that unlike if you're coming from the Ethernet LAN world with switches, all the ports pretty much do the same thing except for the uplink ports. That's not the case with the Fabric Interconnects. As you can see, this group 1 here represents the unified ports. So these are the ports that can be either fiber channel or Ethernet. So you've got 54 ports on the entire device, and only 16 of those ports can be unified ports. And another thing to note is group 3. This group can go down to 1 gig. So of all the ports on the entire device, only 4 of them can go down to 1 gig, and that's mostly because 1 gig isn't that relevant in the data center anymore. And then obviously, group 4 over here is going to be your uplink ports. And then here's a view of the rear panel. And here's the 108 port Fabric Interconnect and the rear view on that. All right, just real quickly here, I've Googled Cisco Nexus 2000 installation guides, and it's going to be more of the same here. It's going to have the front and rear panel information, how to read the LED lights, and all the stuff like that. All right, so that concludes this video. The topics that we went over were what are Fabric Interconnects, their specifications and install guides, and then the same for Fabric Extenders, the specs and install guides for those two. If you found this helpful, give a like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.